casa cazzo guardi? Mi scoppio a testa come dei petardi, yeah. Resto fermo voi scappate codardi.
Alrighty, Kevin, thank you so much for coming on Head of the Eight Ball.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you for having me, Patrick.
Yeah, so obviously it's very different time, COVID and everything. So interestingly enough, one of the main ways, not the main way, I first heard of you because you have a YouTube channel.
Oh yeah.
I saw your infamous Salesforce video.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so I was so curious because some companies don't allow you to do that, mainly because privacy reasons, and I thought that was pretty cool. They kind of just let you record, and it was a very well edited video. That video made me want to work at Salesforce. That's how well edited it was. But how was that? Did you just have to go up to HR and say hey, can I film a video? What was that process like?
I think for me, it was more or less, I just kind of asked my manager what I could record and could not record. So one of the bigger things to note is that there are whiteboards and screens in meeting rooms. So if you look in the video, a lot of the things that actually would have
it's censored, right?
Are blurred out. So just doing due diligence, I think, is more or less enough for them. And there are sometimes companies, they have specific rights to certain areas. So for example, Salesforce doesn't actually let you film or record the top of Salesforce Tower without their permission.
Really?
So that's the only major kind of restriction that was there. So if you were planning to do some form of film, some form of studio, you kind of actually have to have written permission from Salesforce to do a video on the top of Salesforce Tower.
Very interesting.
Other than that, everything else should be up to your due diligence. And I recommend anyone who wants to do that, just make sure you have your manager's approval. And if something is extremely confidential, unless you're willing to lose your job or get sued over it, then don't put it in a video that's on the internet.
How was working at Salesforce though? Because I saw you you interned there, then you went to Amazon, and then you returned. So I'm assuming you obviously liked Salesforce a lot. But what do you like about it? How was it?
I would say Salesforce is the tech dream almost. So
really,
you imagine what all these other tech companies are, what you see at Google, Facebook. Salesforce is a little different in the sense that it's not in this massive kind of headquarters. So for example, Google is in Mountain View, Facebook has Menlo Park. Those are giant campuses. But if you look at Salesforce has 3-4 buildings in downtown San Francisco, right? So you don't have the luxury of these large campuses that come with their own buildings, like bikes and taxis like Facebook has. So in exchange, you get lots of consistencies. So there's 3 main buildings in San Francisco for Salesforce: Salesforce West, Salesforce East, and the Salesforce Tower itself. So those 3 are right next to each other, and they offer a lot of consistency. So Salesforce is really based on the Hawaiian theme. So you have wood, you have greenery, you have all of those types of things there. And almost every single floor will look exactly the same because they believe in their theme, they believe in kind of their color schemes. They want to make everything kind of consistent. And I would say in terms of that, it's really great kind of working there. You get the same vibe, you get a more comfortable kind of feeling, and they provide you almost everything you can imagine as you could look for, from peripherals to snacks to drinks. Almost every single floor has giant bottles of coconut water ready for you to drink, unopened, restocked every single day. Hot Cheetos, there is LaCroix, or there was, and almost anything you can look for in terms of snacks. Anything you want, they basically have it. And the goal there is that you should feel empowered. You should feel unhindered to do whatever it is to be successful there. And if something as little as refreshments are going to stop you, or you have lack of desire to do work because they're not offering you water or luxurious snacks, right? That's not a big deal for them. It's pennies for them. And they have these large agreements to kind of restock their shelves for them. So for them, it's nothing. And for you, you get to kind of get all these nice perks, and you get to contribute more for them. And in the end, it's a win-win for both.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I started off as a software engineer, but then I switched to finance because after I did Goldman Sachs Engineering Essentials program that same May, 2 years ago, I ended up working for a small cryptocurrency firm on Wall Street. And the way your kind of not treated. Yeah, I guess you could say treated in terms of like the perks you get, the sort of like things you have access to, food, drinks, like types of things like you say you're part of a pre-internship program and you have a cohort and you go out to eat and like okay like go wherever you want to eat, we'll reimburse you. Whereas like at Goldman Sachs it was kind of like we'll give you an American Express card, but you can only spend $10 for dinner in Manhattan,
which is
Yeah, that's
one
nothing.
of the most expensive places in the world probably to live or eat at. So it's like I couldn't even buy like a sandwich and pack of Skittles with that kind of like money. But like they do tech just does such a good job, just like taking care of like the little things that make you like want to work there rather than work there for the prestige per se or like for the name. In order to eventually like leave and then get like some very good role at a different place. Where tech, like people go there and want to stay there, and I think that's kind of reason why they attract so much talent to that industry.
it's unbelievable.
I agree.
Yeah. But for Salesforce, the food there, how like because like did you have buffets at Salesforce?
Oh, so one of the things that Salesforce believes in that's also different than the other companies is, if you think about it, Salesforce employs a lot of people. These tech companies employ a lot of people in every city that they're in, Seattle, San Francisco, Menlo Park, right? And if you pay each one of your employees like 130, 140K, and you also offer them food, where does their money go, right? Like, where are they going to spend it on if you're not going to spend it on food? So
Very true.
If you're in downtown in a city, it's a little bit different there, and they don't really have a lot of cafeterias, and instead they believe that you are compensated above like what the other people would get. Like the base salary is usually a little higher in San Francisco than it is for like, in Menlo Park because of the higher cost of living. And what they do and what they kind of expect in exchange is you are now living in that city. You should contribute back to the economy of that city. So instead of us offering you solid meals, just go and buy the meal. Like go support a local restaurant that's nearby. So during lunchtime, almost like every Salesforce employee would go down, either they're on MealPal lunch plans, or you would go and kind of just support a local business. And at the salary you're getting, like a sandwich or a lunch a day is not really that big of a deal. And the other businesses, they would need it a lot more. So if every employee spends $10 to $15 a day, that doesn't add up to a lot for a regular person, but for the business, it can make or break them. So that's a big deal for Salesforce, and they believe in that. That's why they don't offer kind of catered food. And the catered food for the other companies is more or less a trick to get you to keep working there. It's a nice benefit. It truly is. The food is fresh, organic sometimes. And if you look in the times that they offer the food, it's to get you in the office earlier and to get you to stay at the office later. So an example is some places only offer dinner at 6 p.m. Right. And if you live in San Francisco, where are you going to go if work ends at 5 or 4:30, right? You're going to go and take a bus all the way to where and then come back for it. So instead, you just stay and work until 6, get free food. Breakfast is maybe at 8. Then you get into the office at 8:30. So you're already there and you get to spend the whole day there. They give you breakfast, lunch, dinner, but it comes at the cost of living, breathing, and dying at that company.
Sneaky little trick. I did not know that. That's very interesting.
It's a nice perk though. It truly is a nice perk. You get to save a lot more money if the company kind of prepares the food for you, and you get the choice of like, oh, I want barbecue today, or I want this or that. So you get the choice to pick, but Salesforce believes in spending money back to the city because that's the city you work in. You should pay and contribute back to the economy.
Very cool. And I got a question for you. So when you go out to eat, like, were you the kind of person that kind of like had like a go-to spot on like your lunch break you went to get food, or did you want to like try other places like around like your area?
So I used MealPal before. So MealPal is like, so I used MealPal, and there were 2 other days where I would just go and pick something. So it's usually whatever my friends and I would go pick. And I think there were 5 or 10 restaurants that were like more like express kind of thing. So you just walk in, order, it takes like 2-3 minutes, anything from like burritos to tacos to stuff like that. So,
Very cool. And so your experience overall in Salesforce, how does that, would you say, relate to Thomson Reuters? Because I found that very interesting because there's not many people that I know work at like, you know, a news organization that isn't specifically related to like, you know, being a journalist or some sort of like supervisional role. So how was it different? Did you like Salesforce more, or?
I wouldn't say I liked it more. They were both very great experiences. So Salesforce is in an entire different industry than Thomson Reuters. So Thomson Reuters is famous for Reuters News. Reuters News is what the consumer knows them for. But I worked more on the Thomson side, which is their more business kind of software. So I worked for the tax and accounting software. So that was my first internship and my second one. And basically, the team that I was working on was sales and use tax. So kind of the logic and the jurisdiction kind of math for if I buy an iPhone, how much sales tax do I pay? Or if Apple ships me an iPhone, how much do they have to pay or do I have to pay? Because all those little rules make a big deal, because when you're manufacturing products, it doesn't make sense for you to be taxed at every single step for you to produce a product. So for example, you're making a book. If you are taxed to buy the actual leather for the cover, the actual binding, the actual paper, every single time, every single purchase, you pay sales tax. And then you also pay sales tax on the actual sale of a book. That makes no sense, because every single step of the way, you're losing 8 to 10%, depending on where you're at.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it makes sense at the very end when the product is being sold to charge sales tax. And that in itself is very critical in calculating for businesses. And it's not a very I wouldn't say it's like the prettiest kind of job, right? You tell someone, oh, I work for Facebook and I work on social media versus I work on tax software. It's not like the nicest thing to say when you like say it to people, but in the end, I would say those types of fields or industries have a lot more practical problems to kind
and
of
it's so
solve.
intuitive, it sounds like. I like that. That's very interesting. I did not know Thomson Reuters. There's a difference. I thought it was always just like, you know, I type in like, you know, where the Hong Kong index is at, and then Thomson Reuters will have like an update. I always thought it was just a news organization. I did not know there's a difference. So Reuters is the news organization, and then Thomson is more of like the platforms and services that they provide.
Yeah, that's correct.
Very interesting. And which
office did you work at?
I was the one in Dallas, so that was the tax and accounting kind of headquarters.
Did you like the area though, where it was in Dallas? Did you like it compared to San Francisco, or was obviously San Francisco
much better atmosphere?
I would say it's different, right? Like,
yeah,
it's a Texas place. So I'm from Texas, so that also lets me have like
a
car and drive around. So I would say different work style, different lifestyle, but they're both pretty good. Yeah.
Did you prefer to have a car when you went to go about doing your business, or did you prefer to kind of like walk and
not have access to your car?
I think it's useful having a car is pretty useful, but in San Francisco, it's not. Like, you are better off in life without a car.
In San Francisco?
Yeah, it is actually cheaper to Uber everywhere than it is to own a car. So if your plan is to Uber to work every single day, it would cost you maybe $5 to $10 to Uber if you're like within 2-ish miles. So that's only $20 a day times like a week is $100 a week. Right, and you're working for 52 weeks. That's only $5,000, right?
Yeah.
But if you want to buy a car, your car payments are going to be over $5,000 to $10,000 like a year, right? If you want to buy a nice car, right, and you have to pay for insurance, you have to pay for parking. Parking itself in the city is $300 a month if you can find a spot.
Really.
So that's my take on it. It's really cheaper just to Uber everywhere and then just go from there. But if you're in a different city, it depends really, and it depends on your lifestyle, etc. If you are extremely extravagant, you want to drive a Porsche and show off to work, that's all up to you. So, yeah.
Very interesting. Have you decided if you want to go back to California, or have you decided that maybe it's not your style?
California is great.
It's not
California,
your style.
California is great. I'm thinking just going to Seattle for now. So my plan is to move to Seattle because that's where my job is, and then depending on where it takes me after, that's what it is. Yeah.
Very interesting. So why did you pick Seattle? Because that's a very interesting city.
Yeah. So when I interned at Amazon, my product manager, she left Amazon like a few months after I did and joined a startup. And that's the startup I'm at now. And she basically asked if I was willing to interview after while I was looking for my full-time offer. So I interviewed with her, and then she and the rest of the company kind of convinced me that, okay, this is worth declining an offer from Salesforce, an offer from Amazon, just to see like what the startup is. And that's kind of the path that I've picked.
Kevin, where are you originally from? Are you from the Texas area?
Yeah, I'm from Houston, yeah.
Born and raised?
Yes.
Interesting. And so, growing up as a kid, did you always know you wanted to go into this space, or is it something that kind of piqued your interest in late in high school or college?
I've always kind of had a knack for it. I didn't really fully study it until like senior year of high school. So if anyone is interested in getting into this field, the barrier for entry is very low. You just need a computer and you can start learning.
Yeah.
And then you can go from there, which is the really nice thing about this field. But because of the low barrier to entry, I think industry favors the degrees from these prestigious universities in the recruitment process a lot more than the actual kind of skill. So if you are a computer science student from Berkeley or Stanford or MIT versus a computer science student from like Houston Community College or a self-taught programmer, these companies and industry will favor like you from those universities.
Yeah, definitely. And the interesting thing about tech that I realized, you're talking about barriers to entry is so low, like very low. And what makes it also so low is also like the people and culture in tech as well. Like I notice people are so willing to just like help you. Like you can reach out to pretty much virtually anybody in LinkedIn and just like, hey, like I have an interview and I'm having a hard time with data structures and algorithms. Like, do you have any tips for me? And I'm not even kidding. Most often than not, I would say legitimately 45-50% of the time, a random person will reply to you with like very elaborated explanations. Like, here's what I did, and if you need any help, like, I'm more than happy to come on like a phone call. And it's funny because that's how I started off. Asking for information for my interviews because I wasn't good at them when I started them.
And then I tried to do the same thing when I moved into finance. And I promise you, I reached out to around 70 to 80 people, I would say, on LinkedIn. And I think only one replied to me. And ironically enough, it was Dimitri Bianco, who was my last person I had on the podcast. So it's kind of interesting. The more people in tech are just more willing to help you, maybe because they understand like the process of like, having to go through interviews and whiteboarding questions and just like overall in general. I find that very interesting. But I wanted to ask you, and then I tried to do the same thing when I moved into finance. And I promise you, I reached out to around 70 to 80 people, I would say, on LinkedIn. And I think only one replied to me. And ironically enough, it was Dimitri Bianco, who was my last person I had on the podcast. So it's kind of interesting. The more people in tech are just more willing to help you, maybe because they understand like the process of like, having to go through interviews and whiteboarding questions and just like overall in general. I find that very interesting. But I wanted to ask you.
So you mentioned Amazon, and you have an Amazon certification, which from what I remember back when I was part of Capital and Software Engineering program, because they are a big user of Amazon Web Services, Capital One. So what I realized is they said when you work at Amazon, at the end of, I think, your internship, I think you're required to get some certifications.
And then I tried to do the same thing when I moved into finance. And I promise you, I reached out to around 70 to 80 people, I would say, on LinkedIn. And I think only one replied to me. And ironically enough, it was Dimitri Bianco, who was my last person I had on the podcast. So it's kind of interesting. The more people in tech are just more willing to help you, maybe because they understand like the process of like, having to go through interviews and whiteboarding questions and just like overall in general. I find that very interesting. But I I wanted to ask you
I
when
think
you
it's
were
after your first year
yeah.
or 2 years, when you finish the TDP rotation program, you would have your, what's it called? Architecture
So
associate,
yeah.
something like that. Yeah.
So do you think that has helped you when you try to look for a different role? Is that something kind of just proprietary to Amazon, just because like they have obviously a structure and that's the structure they believe in?
Yeah, I see. Just thinking about it, the actual certification itself is more or less generally applicable. So, uh, sure, Amazon has their own things, and every company has their own things, but the concepts that are there, like RDS, relational databases, or access control lists, or stuff like that, those are pretty common ideas across
Yeah.
every cloud platform, and they're applicable everywhere. Sure, you just have to learn the different name for it and where to click or how to use the API for it, but all of those concepts are generally applicable. And I would say the certification is more or less a solidification of your knowledge, because the tests are more or less just to verify that you understand something. But if you just study the test, you get no real value out of it, which is kind of what a lot of people are trying to do now. I took the exam to kind of verify my understanding of AWS because I was using it heavily for Reuters, and I don't like just copying and pasting or randomly clicking things. So if you actually understand something, then taking a test to verify your understanding is worthwhile. But if you are taking a test and studying the test just to get like credibility, then when it actually comes down to using it, you will not be able to use it as a company needs to scale. So that's kind of my take on it. And I would say if you're really looking to learn the cloud, it does help like outline it, which steps you need to kind of understand, what is an EC2 instance, what is like all of this. And I think it's worthwhile to learn, but not worthwhile to study the exam, just to use the exam as verification of knowledge.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And actually, I wanted to ask you. So you said you had kind of started to get exposed into like the computer science field per se at the end of high school. What was the like the first language you kind of learned? What's your first language? I guess.
Oh, like realistically, it was C++, but I think one of the first projects that I was doing was, if you remember back then, before like Apple started being really free with the software now, people used to jailbreak their iPhones and get Cydia, this app store and stuff like that. So one of the projects that I kind of did was I just took different packages from other people and I just started copying and pasting a bunch of JavaScript code from other people to try to get what I was looking for. And it was as simple as just changing like wallpapers, because Apple back then didn't let you change the wallpaper on your phone. So there were hacks for it. And then making like little scripts that would change the background like every 5 or 10 seconds, just playing around with that. I had no clue what I was doing and I just copy and pasted different things from other people. And eventually I got somewhere. So I think that was a worthwhile project. And that was just in JavaScript kind of back then, but it wasn't a real thing. So my first real like language where I actually took the time to learn it was C++.
Very interesting. And so you kind of had an idea of like how to program before you even went to college, like kind of, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
if you really think about it, the base idea is breaking things down.
Yeah.
So programming itself is not the language, is not the compiler, is not any of that. It's more or less the ability to break things down. So if you're given a problem, how can you break it down into smaller bits? And I think that's the key thing that people should be studying, not these actual programming language, not these tricks like, oh, Python, I can reverse a string by doing : -1. Like that's not really what computer science is or what really software engineering is. Instead, you should focus on kind of solving a problem, but being able to break it down into smaller parts that can be tested, that can be implemented, that can be worked in parallel, because those types of things are the thoughts and the topics that actually matter for real software engineering. Because anyone can learn how to write for loops, learn how to run an IDE, anyone can pay for that too. But if you aren't able to think about the problem in a way that's not your standard problem. So in real life, your problems are, I want to reverse a string. Your problems are like, I want to make sure this user is able to log in at 1,000 times per second, stuff like that, like random little requirements there. And being able to break down those problems into smaller ones is probably the key thing like a software engineer or computer science student would need in order to do well.
So that's such a good point. And so what are your thoughts on like how kind of universities and colleges kind of teach programming? Do you think it's adequate, or do you think like the entire like infrastructure just needs to kind of have some adaptability to it?
I think the universities are doing a pretty reasonable job. So the thing to think about is a lot of computing, a lot of software engineering has only really bloomed in the last 20 years, right? But these universities have been around for what, generations, 10, like my school's been around for almost like 200, like 150 plus years, right? It's interesting to see how they're handling a lot of the newer things. A common thing that university students complain about is large amounts of students, very little professors, and like inadequate kind of teaching. But what they don't tell you, the students themselves, is they're not putting in the effort to kind of learn themselves, right? Just because you're in computer science doesn't mean that everything will be handed to you, right? You still have to put the rest of the work in to study it yourself. Just because you're in a field of demand doesn't mean that you don't have to put in the work. Like, that's what people are missing here. And sure, there is room for improvement everywhere, right? Universities themselves aren't like the best at doing things. They offer extremely high quality education, but at literally death rate loans to kind of afford. So they do offer like a good breakdown of like a real computer science degree, right? You start off with entry-level classes that teach you how to code. Like, what is your basic control structures? How do you do for loops? How do you do while loops? How do you do import statements? Like, what exactly those are? And that's just so you can do something. And after that, they teach you more fundamentals that were kind of learned a while back, which are your data structures, algorithms. And then after that, that's enough for you to write basic things. You can do basic programs, do basic tasks, which is enough to kind of build off of. And that strong foundation is kind of critical. And that's why universities take a while to teach you them. Like, anyone can go look online for some Coursera thing or like look and do that. But if you don't understand like exactly how does a map work, or how does a vector work, or why is kind of amortized insertion for an array O of 1, right? Like, what does it exactly all mean? Then you're just going to be blindly coding. And when you don't have a strong foundation, the rest of the classes get hard. Like, you don't understand networks properly, you don't understand distributed systems. And those other classes build on knowledge that is assumed to be taught and understood at lower levels. So universities do a great job at breaking it down. Some universities do it differently than others. They offer roughly the same path. And there is room for improvement on, say, for example, like the quality of kind of teaching. Maybe 500 students to one professor and one TA is not ideal, but sometimes that's what the university decides to do. All online for entry-level classes might not also be like ideal, but those are kind of decisions up to the university to make. But I would say universities themselves are doing an okay job. They're not doing great, but we can't sit around and criticize them when we don't have any other suggestions that would be scalable or beneficial as a business to them. And the other thing is that universities do well in kind of offering major topics that you want, right? So machine learning is one of the newer things that is relevant to the field. And universities are quick to adapt, because a lot of universities do research, and a lot of the money goes into kind of doing research. So that's why they have these professors. And sure, you ask a teacher if they want to teach machine learning, which is their research that they did 10 years of research for, of course they're going to say yes, right? So these professors, they get the ability to teach exactly what they studied, and students get the ability kind of to learn from people in industry or people who are in academia for so long. So I would say universities do really well in kind of teaching the newer topics that people would need to understand, but not from like a tutorial perspective, right? Anyone can go look up how to make a tensor and use TensorFlow and just train a neural net. But what exactly does that mean in terms of math, the calculus required to do back propagation, stuff like that? So universities do a very good job at teaching fundamentals, which I think are crucial for everyone.
Yeah, definitely. And so, so let's say you know JavaScript, right? And you wanted to learn, let's say, a certain framework. So something that was trending a couple years ago. I'm not sure if it is still now because I don't really follow the trends of programming languages much anymore. But React.js was very, very popular.
Yeah.
2 or 3 years. Yeah, probably is. So what is your approach? Do you still have that? Do you keep the same fundamental approach regardless of the programming language, or does it kind of shy away or deviate from when you try to learn like a particular framework?
I think it's more or less you have to determine the situation you're in.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to do it for a project or for like work, you're kind of forced to learn that language for the necessity of completing a goal. So if your like ticket or your working item is to change something, you would have to understand the code enough to be able to do and make those changes. To really be able to do that, I think you'd have to understand the language. And kind of going back to your question, it probably starts off with asking what is the reason for the language's existence. So creating something for the sake of creating something doesn't actually work. So there's a reason why things were created, such as why does Java exist versus C++, or why does Python exist over C++ or Java, or why does JavaScript exist but I can't use JavaScript inside of Python, right? Like there's these different questions, and understanding why they actually came to be is crucial to kind of understanding the language, because the reason for a language's existence ends up being what shapes its design. So React.js, if you understand kind of the framework behind like why it came to be and why it was necessary, like the observable subscription pattern, stuff like that, versus what we had before, like promises and all these other things, it comes a lot easier once you understand the principles behind the language and why it came to be. Then you'd be able to understand the rest of the framework, and then you can learn to write it. But once you understand the reason for its existence, then you're more or less able to argue that we need this because of this. So a lot of times if you're trying to do something and you want to use something radically new, such as maybe I use purely vanilla JavaScript and now they're asking me to use React, or they want me to use Angular, you have to be able to kind of say, we don't need Angular because of this, or Angular would give us a benefit because of this, and we'd be able to truly leverage it, stuff like that. So you want to be able to answer those questions without fully understanding the language and the principles behind it.
Yeah, definitely. And Kevin, so let's say someone is interested in entering the field and they want to learn a new language. Like, what did you have when you started out? Did you have like a kind of like an attack plan behind, like, in your head, like how you wanted to go about it, or did you kind of, because it sounds like you at first you kind of like you took an interest and you kind of were playing around with it, and then it kind of over time just became more natural because you had so much exposure to it over like a duration of time.
I'd say if you're trying to like get into it for the first time, would be to kind of understand the basics behind it. Like, what are functions? What are for loops? What are if conditions? Understanding kind of the basic logic and math behind it would be critical if you're just trying to get into it. But if you already kind of know that stuff, say you already know C++, but you're looking to learn Java, then you already know the basics. You just don't know how to write the code for it. And you can quickly just do tutorials on how you kind of write the code for it. And they have different exercise like things for you to do. So one of the things I did was when I was first learning like Java or something, I think it was called Coding Bat or something like that. And basically they give you these little problems like, I want to play tic-tac-toe or something, or I want to do this or that. And you basically write the program in Java or this programming language of choice. And if it works, then you plus run. And then if it compiles, runs, then you move on to the next problem. But they're very elementary problems. It's not like LeetCode or HackerRanks where it's like extreme problem solving. It's more like, I want to print out the first 10 numbers of maybe like all the odd numbers, right? So the first 10 odd numbers, printing those out, how would I do that? In a for loop, and then change it to a while loop, change it to in do while, stuff like that. So that's what I recommend there. And then you'd be able to get a basic understanding of it, and then you could go from there.
Have you ever thought, So when you were in college and then you took an interest to computer science, did you ever think about going into a different field, or did you, like, once you were in computer science, did you always know, like, yeah, this is what I like, I have passion for it, I think I'm going to stick with this? Like
I
finance,
wanted
for
to do
example.
petroleum engineering besides this.
Really?
So
Oh,
it's
that's right, 'cause
either,
you're in Texas, yeah.
computer science or petroleum engineering. So I had a huge passion for the science of life. So chemistry, biology, physics. I had a huge passion. I did almost all the AP classes for that in high school and did really well. I got fives on the AP exams there. But the oil crash that kept happening and then happened again, I decided, okay, yeah, maybe petroleum engineering is not the decision to go. So when you're picking your career, one of the things like I advise people is if you're going to go to school, then think about where you will be after you graduate. If you will be in a position that is worse than when you started or the same, it might not have been worth it to go at all.
Yeah.
For example, if you go to school and you pay like basic 20, 30,000 for school, and if you went to community college, if you didn't get anywhere, then there was no point in going, right? Because you're not in this better situation in life. You lost 4 years of your life and you paid all that money and you got nowhere.
For nothing.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you lost money and you lost time. So that doesn't make any sense. So when you're thinking about what to do, think about where you need to be after and whether or not the choice you make will get you anywhere.
You know, interestingly enough, 20% of people only like after they graduate go into fields that are actually somewhat related to their major. So a lot of people go in
I agree.
wanting to do something, and then most of the time end up doing something not related to what they actually studied, which is very interesting.
I think that's also fair, right? Because when you're entering college, you're only like 18, and you don't know what to do with your life, and it's not fair to expect these kids to know what they want out of life. And if they're looking for themselves, college is the perfect place to do it. I just wish the fee of doing that did not cost like a mortgage, right?
Yeah.
It's like basic public universities still cost like 10 to 20,000 a semester almost, including cost of living. Just that kind of debt when you're trying to figure yourself out is not worth it. It's unfair to these kids.
And it's taken effect to some of the decisions they would have probably preferred to have taken after the fact. For example, housing. You know, our generation do not want to buy houses after they graduate, which is why at a time, like, you know, houses weren't being purchased, but now that's, you know, starting to actually kind of escalate a little bit now, which is pretty interesting. But yeah, it is a lot of money. Like if you go, especially if you go to school, like, you know, in Texas, like, you know, SMU, which is about 60,000 just for the tuition.
Yep.
Like, you know, is it really worth it at that point? Then perhaps maybe you've gone, like, going to UT. I mean, UT, obviously it's hard to get into, but if you could, like, you know, paying $9,000 a year is nowhere near 60,000 because you're paying twice as less to go to school for 4 years than you are just for 1 year at SMU.
Yeah, it also depends on like which college you want to go to. So different universities specialize in different things, and some people might choose to go to a different college based off of like alumni, maybe their parents went somewhere. So like a lot of those things go into consideration when a student picks which university to go to.
Mm-hmm.
Kevin, did you so throughout the duration of the pandemic, have you like developed any hobbies or anything? Because I know a lot of people, like, you know, because we have so much free time, like, you know, we just, you know, we develop like, you know, some people develop hobbies, some people playing soccer more because there's not many basketball courts open in the country, like, you know, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, the major thing for me is I spent a lot more time watching Netflix. So
Yeah.
there are a lot of newer things that I didn't know I would like. So I was a huge fan of like Korean dramas, and I've watched a considerable amount now. So that's something I thoroughly kind of enjoy, like just relaxing and watching those shows. And then besides that, I spent because a lot of time before I had like interest in cars. So I spent a lot of time kind of studying cars, and like the used market for cars is kind of extremely well right now because everyone's buying cars. The chip kind of shortage is also playing into that. So like I spent a lot of time like studying luxury cars that are like reasonable, like the Germans or the American kind of luxury cars, just to see how they compare, like what markets they kind of play into, and just that's what I spent a lot of my time looking at and kind of learning about.
So you don't speak Korean, do you?
No, no, no. I speak Cantonese.
Cantonese.
So, it's a dialect, yeah.
So where are your parents from? Where did you learn Cantonese?
My parents are from they're Chinese born in Vietnam, so they came here during kind of the Vietnam War kind of thing. So I'm a first generation Asian American, and yeah, that's how my parents came here. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Have you ever watched Blacklist or Ozark by any chance?
Wait, which shows?
Blacklist and Ozark, or is it?
Black. No, is that the? No, no, I haven't. I've heard of both of those, but I haven't watched.
Blacklist is the one with the old guy who likes to wear the fedora a lot.
Yes, yes, and he has a list of people that he's
Yes.
off to kill,
Yes.
right? I think so. Yes. Wait, which shows?
Blacklist and Ozark, or is it the Ozark?
No, is that the? No, no, I haven't. I've heard of both of those, but I haven't.
Blacklist is the one with the old guy who likes to wear the fedora a lot.
Yes, yes, and he has a list of people that he's off to kill,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
I think so. Yes.
Not to kill, but it's just a list, and it can be. It's usually he wants to either capture them because the person owes him money, or he just wants to see them because he hasn't seen them in a long time, or he wants to get rid of them.
Yeah, does he team up with
The
someone from the FBI?
Yeah.
And it's specifically a girl because of some connection. I forget. I think I watched the first episode, but yeah, yeah.
Well, I don't want to spoil it for you, but yeah, there is a specific there is a reason why he wants to have a relationship with that particular person.
Got it.
Yeah, very interesting show. But I think
Actually, so what I did during the pandemic,
Yes.
I've always wanted to learn a language. So I actually learned Italian over the pandemic, and I actually started speaking it at school, and of course at school it's just terrible.
the way they teach it, mainly because the incentives are so different. I realized because one of the biggest, the most important step, in my opinion, when you learn a language, is making mistakes. Because that's the only way you'll understand what to say, how to say, and also because you're practicing speaking it. Because it's not like after you speak a language, after a couple months, you just wake up one day and just start sounding like a native speaker. It's through just like your arms and legs, you have muscles, and your mouth has just been so accustomed to saying it, you start to sound like how you're supposed to naturally. And interestingly enough, when you take when I was taking tests in Italian, I did terrible. I did awful, and it wasn't because I didn't understand what I was doing. It's just that I always get points off for misspelling one letter. I didn't have an accent on something. So you're being disincentivized to make mistakes, and it's just that's the most important part of learning a language. And once I understood that factor, I was just much more willing to make mistakes and go out there, because the only thing you really need to focus on is trying to be heard, in the sense that when you try to say something, as long as you're getting your message across, people will correct you, and then that's how you'll understand the mistake you made, and then you maintain it that way. So I don't know, it's just a lot of I think during the pandemic, I think I definitely been more humbled for sure. But I also developed just so much more interest, just because we've had so much more free time.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, exactly. But I have a question. So you've been to Seattle, Houston, and California. Have you ever considered working in the tri-state area, like New Jersey, Connecticut, New York?
I've considered it. I've visited New York quite frequently because I've interviewed companies in New York, and then I think if I were to work in that area, I'd probably pick somewhere in Soho or that area, because everywhere else seems a little bit not for me. So I think it depends on the person, and it might be because I've never spent an extended period of time on the East Coast, where I might be slightly against, or have a slight bias against working in the East Coast versus the West. But it's definitely a nice place. I very much imagine working there is almost the same as if you're working on the West Coast. All the perks are there, all of the nice companies are also there. So definitely worthwhile for people. But I think for me, I prefer either Texas or the West Coast.
Yeah, and it's so funny because when you brought up luxury cars, obviously, like, Italy, like, because, like, I learned a lot about Italian culture, because I spoke, because of, from learning Italian, and interestingly enough, I learned about Ferrari, not just the car itself, but the person, because the name Ferrari is named after a very famous person in Italy named Enzo Ferrari, from the 1930s, which is why it's named Ferrari, because that's the last name. So have you do you have an interest in specifically in German cars, or do you have an interest just like very luxurious cars in general?
I'm personally a huge fan of Mercedes-Benz. So
Really?
yeah, I enjoy kind of like the choices Mercedes-Benz makes and kind of their history and kind of creating. They like to brag about being the first real petroleum like automobile. Like they coined it, or they also coined kind of the like crash tests and stuff like that. So
Really?
yeah, like I think from like a luxury perspective, I enjoy Mercedes a lot more than kind of like a BMW or like Lamborghini, Ferrari, because a part of me also thinks that I will never be rich enough to afford those cars.
You don't think so?
No,
Really?
even if I could afford those types of cars, there's probably a lot more that you could spend the money on.
Yeah.
Like a Lamborghini costs what 200-300K.
Sure.
Surprisingly, the Lamborghini SUV costs less than the actual Lamborghini, which the Urus or whatever. That's kind of interesting if you're able to spend willingly the same amount for a car that you would most people on their whole mortgage, and that's questionable here. And what I also kind of don't like too much about those like luxury cars is that the banks are so willing to give loans out for these impossible loans, right? So some common things that you can see now on advertisements is, for example, you can get a Nissan Rogue or a Nissan, and that's not a luxury car, it's a common car.
Yeah.
And it's an 84-month lease or loan. It's an 84-month loan, zero down, but 84 months is 7 years. If you look at the depreciation of a car, by the time it's 7 years, it's worth like 10-20% of the value. So it makes sense that the depreciation is like that way, because given the chance to buy a used or a new car, you have to make it worth it. But the fact that it's actually kind of legal to allow you to buy a car and be under in less than a year, I think that should be addressed, because that's crazy, because you're tricking these kids into taking these loans out for cars they can't afford, and then once they get into a minor accident or something happens, they're screwed, and like their credit's destroyed. Exactly. And everything. And it's like a common trend now. And cars are nice, like cars are beautiful, they go fast, they make you feel like you are in control, and that's a beautiful thing. Yeah, Fast and Furious, minus the drifting and minus the aggression, because safety, but it gives you like a nice sense of like you've made it. But if you're taking a loan out that takes up 30% of your income every single month, have you really made it?
It's like a false sense of empowerment.
Yeah, false sense of empowerment, and it's like a false wealth thing that people like to kind of protrude and show, and that I think that needs to be addressed. But it's not a problem for anyone to solve who would willingly make money, because you as an individual, you get to buy a car, and it's a car of your dreams, like an S-Class or an E-Class or whatever. It only costs you $500 to $1,000 a month. You can afford that maybe. But if you had to pay like in cash for it, or if you had to pay 50% down, something like that, that'd be too much to ask. So the banks make more money off of giving you a loan. You get to drive the car of your dreams. But just the fact that everyone can take a 7-year risk, and that's just not, I don't really agree with that kind of lifestyle. And I think the bank should be more transparent about the fact that you will be under if you just make the regular monthly payments in the first year or two.
Yeah, definitely. And it's so interesting because a lot of athletes tend to buy these cars, and then once they realize that they're not playing their sport anymore and making millions of dollars, they have an issue paying not just they usually buy out the cars, but when they try to resell it to try to get some money back out of it, the money that they sell it at is probably, like, I would say 30 or like 45% of what they actually purchased it for, so they've lost like half of it, because they usually buy it like, you know, at the beginning of the careers, especially if they're well known. They buy it at the beginning of the careers, like after their first couple of paychecks, and then after they're done with their career, like, you know, if they, because most athletes, not most, but a good amount of athletes go bankrupt. There's some famous ones, obviously Mike Tyson, like,
Yes.
etc. So they'll try to sell it, and they can't sell the car for nearly as much as they bought it for. So that's I think cars are interesting because it's really the one of the few assets that decline the second that you buy it. And obviously they all decline at different rates. Like, for instance, Honda will not depreciate nearly as much as, like, you know, BMW, just because for a numerous amount of reasons. But yeah, cars are definitely very interesting. I would have never thought that you had an interest in cars like that. Judging from, like, you know, what we talked about, obviously, like, you know, you like petroleum, you like sciences, but very interesting. That's very, very interesting to think about.
I think it's actually just more or less because one of the first like luxury cars that I got to drive was like a base SUV, like an ML 350. And like, if you really think about it, Mercedes is kind of famous for simplicity with luxury. And each one of the luxury cars, these nice cars, they have a specific market that they're trying to tap. So if you associate Mercedes-Benz, it's more generally like older luxury.
Yeah.
And that's the general vibe. Like, the last generation people would kind of buy a Mercedes-Benz. A younger person would probably buy a BMW or an Audi, because those are more performance-based. Audi is more tech-based. Lexus is more of their, it's in the middle between newer and younger generations, stuff like that. So yeah, for me, I really just enjoy the simplicity of it, because a BMW, sure, like, you want to redline it, or you want to do like all these like fancy cool things and have all these like tech things, but in the end, like, a true luxury car feels different than a performance-based one. And I also don't want my car to die after 60,000 miles too. So like, depends on what people buy.
Rover.
Oh yeah, Range Rover is also pretty nice. Yes, those are nice.
Yeah, but they because I remember when my aunt used to drive, like, what's the SUV called? The BMW, is it the X5? Is it called?
Yeah, the X5 is the like full-size SUV, and then the X7 is the super large one.
Those are terrible, because like not only do they break down super easy, like the parts themselves to actually repair for Indian BMW are like, you might as well just like buy like a Honda
or something, because it can escalate very quickly depending on like what.
I think it's a little different there to kind of compare, because a luxury car, they do different things, right? Because when you drive luxury, if you truly can afford luxury, you shouldn't care about a service or repair, right? Because if you can afford a Mercedes-Benz, like actually afford it, so like if you can afford an S-Class, then you should be at least making 300K, right? If you're making that much money and you have to even shed a thought about paying 2,000 to 3,000 to replace like a radiator hose, like, you're in the wrong car. Right? If that's on your mind. So people buy these BMWs that they can't afford, and that's why it's on their mind. So when you buy a car now, you should be well aware of the cost. An oil change at BMW is $400 or $500, right? That's oil change comes with filters.
Yeah.
Like, that's like on the bare minimum if nothing is wrong with your car. You want to repair, it's $1,000+. They charge for labor, they charge for OEM parts, but that's kind of your choice to buy that car. And if you don't understand the cost, then why'd you buy it? So I think it's not BMW's fault for making it that expensive.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And they choose to do that. And I would also say a lot of the things that go wrong with the BMWs are intentional, because they have more sensors, they have more ability to protect the engine in case something goes wrong, and they lean more towards like, if something were to go wrong, they'll shut it down. So they'd rather protect the engine, which is the most expensive part of the car, than for you to do something stupid and kind of
vendor or something.
Yeah. So like, that's fair in the sense for the type of market there. If you're complaining about the cost of a repair, then that's your problem. You're in the wrong car. If you want a cheap car that's gonna be affordable, like repairable, oil changes are pretty simple, you can get your Japanese car, you can get a Toyota, you can get a Ford, you can get all of that. But if you're complaining, then you're in the wrong car.
Yeah, definitely. Such a good point. But where did you develop like this fascination for cars? Did you just watch like a lot of Fast and Furious movies and were like, I wanna like like
I
see
would say,
why
like, I'm
these
not like
cars are
the,
built?
what is it, like the Japanese like older imports. I'm like modified racer, stancing. I'm not a huge fan of all of those. I think it's just like one of the nicer things in life that everyone can aspire to kind of own, like a nice house, a nice car.
Sure.
Those are things that are relatively achievable in your lifetime, and especially with the way things are going now, definitely people can afford houses and cars to some degree. Maybe not houses, but you can easily afford a car. Like Teslas are becoming more affordable, Mercedes are becoming more affordable. They offer these different tiers, and I think just the the image that I had of people when they would pull up in like a Mercedes is more or less like they've made it in life, and that's kind of what kind of inspired me to look more into it. Like what makes these cars so much better than a Toyota?
Yeah.
What really makes it better? So that's what kind of inspired me.
What kind of Mercedes would you buy if you could buy one, an AMG?
Mm, so I'm kind of an SUV fan right now. I
Wagon.
Not a G-Wagon. That's a little too much. I've been looking more or less at like the GLEs. So the GLE is like
Oh yeah.
yeah. So that one,
Nice.
a GLE 450 is a practical one. That one's about like 65K, and then maybe like a GLE 63. You can get one of those for maybe 80 to 90. Those are more practical kind of SUVs. But I guess for other people, they'd be more interested in kind of the sedans or the mid-size SUVs. So the EQA is one of the newer things that are coming here, and that's your like Tesla Model 3 competitor. So that'll eventually come to America, and that's like an electric version of their like small compact SUV, and I think that's a car that's worth buying. So that's something that would be an everyday kind of car. If you're looking for a Tesla Model 3, you could also consider one of those, which is nice.
Very interesting.
Yep.
So what do you think about Tesla? Are you a big Tesla guy or no?
I'm a huge fan. So,
Really?
yeah. So when I was 18, like Tesla was still like pretty big. So I was 18 like 6 years ago. So that was before like all of this trend now. But when I turned like 18 or 19, my goal was when I was 21 was to hop in a Tesla and just try to hit 100. And I learned later on that is actually illegal. Besides the traffic violations that you would be breaking, it is actually illegal in terms of your insurance and all the paperwork you sign when you test drive the car, because
Really?
you legally say I will not break any traffic limits and stuff like that, and then if you do, insurance would not they would not be okay with that. So yeah, but I'm a huge fan of Tesla, and I would say in the last year or two they've made huge strides in actually improving the quality of their cars.
For sure.
So before, if you really think about it, Tesla had, I think the first real Tesla came out in 2009, and since then they've made huge strides to make it like more affordable, almost like you and I could probably eventually get one pretty easily. So they did pretty well in kind of marketing and getting there, but they have a slight problem now because they offer cars that are 50K. Like at the minimum, the Model 3 that you actually want is probably 50K. You can't buy the 35K one. You want autopilot, you want maybe nicer rims, or you want the extended battery. Like sure, Teslas don't offer like all these features, but they still offer a pretty price tag for it. Because a Camry right now, base model is like 25, a Camry SE is 30-ish. So for 50K, you would get a car, and 50K is luxury price point, right? That's some people's yearly salary. So
Yeah.
at that point, Tesla had a nice advantage. They were the only competitor. They were the only like car in electric cars. Now everyone's coming in, and Tesla will have slight problems in terms of
Competition.
making sure that their quality is up to standards and competing with German cars or Lexus or all these other nice cars, because they're coming for that market. And given the choice, a lot of people would rather buy an electric BMW over an electric Tesla, because like Tesla itself is a very nice car, and the major kind of selling point I see is the 0 to 60. Once you do the 0 to 60 that everyone loves, like to like go like this and like fly back with the 0 to 60, that's it. That's all Tesla really has going for it. The software is great too, and the other car companies could learn to spend more money on software, especially Ford. Ford needs to spend a lot of money on software. 'Cause, yeah, I have personal bias. The software there is like unacceptable for modern day society. Like if you go on YouTube now and look up one of the Ford ads, if you can see, you will see literally in the ads that the screen lags in the ad,
Really?
right? Like why would you willingly put a lagging navigation screen, or when they press the back button, you can see it lag? It's like not like lagging phones, lagging software is not like a unsolvable problem. You just spend $5 or $10 more on the hardware, and then you spend an extra like 20, 30K on the actual animations and stuff like that. But I think, yeah, Tesla has a problem that's coming for them. And so far, their balance sheets, everything, like they've been doing really well in terms of selling cars, and they'll need that money in order to compete against the other luxury car makers.
You know, it's so interesting. Like this summer, so I worked at PNC as an institutional asset management, and I had the luxury of speaking to one of the economists because I reached out to him, and we talked about Tesla. And one of the questions we came up with is like, obviously, Tesla is very overvalued. I mean, I think I don't know what the P is. I think it's definitely over 1,000, maybe lower now since they split their stock. But the interesting thing is, I asked him, I was like, so I think it was Gus Voucher, I think it was. So I was like, Gus, so we all know it's overvalued. No one's arguing that. And it's more overvalued now because interest rates are still low. So what percent of Tesla's valuation do you think is attributed to Elon Musk himself? And he said around 20. He'd say if I had to put a number on it, it'd be like 20 to 25%, which is like a quarter of the entire valuation. Because I started to notice that people just have a lot of faith in Elon Musk because it's just a topic of debate, even on CNBC. Like people are asking, like, you know, Elon Musk has continuously said, like, you know, like, you know, we plan on reaching X amount of production by this quarter, and he always falls short relative to what he says on Twitter, and like, you know, it's caught some backfire for him with the SEC, obviously, and stuff.
Yeah.
But people still have faith in him, and they, like, you know, the price of Tesla is just gone up so much, and they're performing well. I mean, not to, like, you know, obviously they're performing well still, like, you know, financially, but it's just so interesting that Tesla is just this exception, and I think it's because the reason, obviously, because they're not valued as like a car, like, you know, Ford or General Motors are valued as, like, you know, a tech company, so they can, that might do a little bit of it. But it's just so interesting. Tesla is a very interesting case study itself.
Yeah, I think it's something to do with more or less, I call it the cult following.
Yeah.
So Tesla itself is, like, Elon Musk is like an interesting character.
He's very
He's
interesting.
one of the few people who are willing to live, breathe, and die for his beliefs. And
Oh, yeah.
he is more of an action person versus a like management person. So if he wants something, he will get it, and he will also do it with you. So if he's pushing for something, he will live, breathe, and die on the assembly line with you. So that's the difference between these other people. And when they see a CEO who doesn't like sit on a golden throne after he's made money, then they're willing to follow that, because it's like a belief that a regular person who's smart is able to get high somewhere and then actually play back and kind of work. So I think just kind of doing that inspires a lot more people. And the fact that no matter what anyone has said, he's been able to deliver to some degree.
Yeah.
Right? People always said electric cars are impossible. And sure, of course they are. Everyone's going to say that because petroleum engines are the only cars that are here. So just by doing the impossible, eventually, like that is enough to earn like a cult following. So I think that's what he has going for him. And the problems he's trying to solve are relevant ones, and I think they're definitely like nice ways of solving the problem. So
Yeah.
he focuses a lot on solving problems, but providing very nice alternatives. So like a Roadster that can go 0 to 60 in 1.9 seconds, that's also all electric, can give you the green kind of eco-friendly kind of movement. So I think he does really well at showing off as well as solving problems, and they're meaningful problems at that.
Yeah, and I think also what people appreciate about him is that he's so honest. They obviously good and bad. I personally like it. So when he interviewed the CEO of Robinhood, he just flat out said, "So, to what degree are you beholden to your Citadel folks?"
Yeah.
But one thing I first heard of him actually. He said something very famous. He went infamous for it. He said he was asked in an interview about like what do you look for in an employer, and he pretty much said like I don't care. If you have a college degree, I don't care if you come from Harvard. You don't even need a college degree. High school education is enough. And so that was just such an interesting take. Because I guess he's just such a firm believer that you can literally just learn anything that yourself as long as you put your mind to it and have some sort of dedication and motivation to it.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a very interesting character. So I wanted to get your thoughts. Obviously, COVID has changed the landscape of like the hiring process. So
yeah.
What do you think that because I've certainly noticed that some companies have been more stringent, obviously, because they don't want to hire as many interns per se, depending on the company, whichever one it is. But in terms of tech, how do you think it's affected like the recruiting process? Because obviously doing interviews, via computer is much different than meeting in person. Like you don't have that interaction. You lose that important aspect of the interview process.
I would say the interview process is roughly still the same. Most internship interviews before were always remote. They never flew anyone out for an internship, except for Microsoft. Microsoft did that. Amazon doesn't do that. Google doesn't do that. Facebook doesn't do that. So if you're looking for an internship, the process is still roughly the same. I would say it's much harder now, considering that what they're doing now is a pretty fair way of doing interviews. It's kind of unfortunate, but what they end up doing is if you apply online, you are given first a key, like an entrance to, 1 second. Sorry, I'm getting a call. Sorry. Yeah, so when you first like apply, say you want to work for Amazon, so as an intern, so what sets you the same or apart from the other people that apply to Amazon? You are from maybe self-taught, right? Like as you mentioned before, maybe you don't need a college degree, like who cares, right? But maybe you're also from Stanford and you want to work for Amazon too. How do you tell them apart? And when you interview someone, like you have to think about the amount of time that it takes to interview someone. You have your engineers that you are literally paying 100+K a year, and you're spending 30 minutes to an hour interviewing a candidate. So that time is worthwhile. So what these tech companies, they decided to do was it's an entrance, it's a key. So whether or not you are worth the time to even consider for an interview is automated now. They will send you a link, a HackerRank, a coder, whatever, CoderPad, something. They will send you a link and you are given a problem or two problems and you are required to kind of complete it and pass test cases. If you're able to write real code that is able to solve the problem that cannot be found elsewhere, so it's specific problems that change, and they're written by those companies specifically so that they are not found anywhere else online. And then if you get it right, if you get it remotely right, then you are given the right to interview. So that's when they actually will send someone to actually kind of call you or schedule an actual interview with an engineer or meet with the team to do interviews. So that's the process, and it's been like that for a few years already. So that process won't change, and I think it only gets harder from here because everyone is saying, oh, I can just study interview questions, and interview questions are the key to the gate, right? So they keep studying interview questions, and then these companies keep making the questions harder or different. So then it ends up like you weed out yourself eventually. And when you really think about it, the ability to kind of, I don't know, merge two trees or merge two like hash maps, something like that's not something you would do on an everyday basis. And even if you do, you would talk to it with someone else and work it out. But the fact that you kind of have to implement these like algorithms in such a short amount of time to solve these problems.
Sure.
Like an example is the finding a cycle in a linked list, right? It took someone a decade to figure out how to do, like to come up with the solution. The original person took him a decade, and you're expected to code a solution for that in 20 minutes, right? Like you're obviously not like that much smarter than a single researcher who spent a decade on it, right? So
that's so interesting. Who is this researcher?
I don't know, you can look it up for the. I heard a story about it from a coworker who's also looking to kind of do job searching again.
Uh-huh.
So that's like the stories kind of behind it, which is interesting. But
Yeah,
on
very.
the other end, it's the only tool that these companies have. So if you think about it, the entry rate for Amazon, Salesforce, Microsoft is well over 100,000. Well over, that's just the salary, no matter where you're going. And, if you're in Austin, Seattle, San Francisco, it's well over 100,000 just base salary. And then you're also getting sign-on bonus, you're getting stock, you're getting like relocation, and you get all the other benefits that come with the prestige of the name.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a small price to pay. If you think about the average salary of a college grad outside of school, that's like what, 40, 50, you're getting double or almost triple depending on it.
Double. Yeah.
Yeah, easily. And you're not doing that much more, right? Like some people have their teachers, they are researchers, they do other things that the world needs, and you're in an in-demand field. And if all you have to do is pay the price to get the key, then some people are willing to do it, which is study these interviews and make sure you know your algorithms like in and out, and being able to write these algorithms that took people a decade to learn and write. So it's interesting to look at it in both ways. It's kind of unfortunate that the only way to judge a candidate is based off their ability to answer these problems, because in reality that doesn't actually explain how it would be to work with someone, or whether or not they'd be able to write scalable code that actually works in production, or whether or not they're going to be communicatable with like actual code reviews and stuff like that.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting point because before they started doing this, because I realized that when I applied to Visa, they sent me one of those entry keys that you referred to. But one of the things I realized is, like, a lot of people will look good on paper, and then when you bring them in for an interview, sometimes it's a totally, completely different thing. Some for the better, some for the worse. But I guess it's like a good way to kind of like filter out that kind of like not waste of time, but to make better use of time in a sense, because if you have a candidate that you thought would be a good fit, but then you feel like, wow, that's a complete waste of time, like I wish like I could have like had some way to filter it, that makes it like a more efficient way. And I think it kind of makes sense in tech, because you're pretty much just replicating a technical interview just without the actual interviewer, there to listen to your thought process, because it's pretty much virtually the same thing. You can't really do that in other fields like finance, or even consulting. I guess you can kind of do like a Zoom call, but that still requires a person. You can't really replicate that in other fields. So that's I guess that's a kind of like interesting thing that tech kind of came up with. They always come up with these very niche kind of like solutions to problems they have, and I think that's what makes kind of tech just so interesting sometimes.
Yes, yeah. Every single time there is a pain point, it's worthwhile for them to fix, because in reality, if they spent time to interview every candidate that came through, that would cost them way more money than it's worth. And then if they hire the wrong person, then it takes at least a year to fire someone, because you have to at least evaluate them and give them a shot. So usually about 6 months for someone to get onboarded and ready to start contributing to a project, because different ecosystems are different. So code bases could be different tools are used, different products, different understandings. And to be fair, it will take about 6 months to actually be able to contribute real things. And then after that, it takes another 6 months to evaluate someone. But even then, you'd have to give them another 3 months for a second chance. So
I have a question for you. I just came up with it because I remember it from a conversation I had. But do you think they're not a problem per se, but is there a inherent I'm going to use the word issue. It's not really an issue, but it just makes sense. Is there an inherent issue in terms of pay raise in terms of software engineering? And you'll understand what I'm saying, but because the retention rate for software engineers is relatively low. I think it's like a year and a half or 2 years, and then they end up switching to other companies. But from what I've heard is that when you're a software engineer, you get your salary is X, and so you work, and then as you stay at the firm longer, you have more responsibilities and you're given more work, but your pay remains stagnant. which is why they tend to leave. Is that
I wouldn't say that's the case,
Okay.
right? Like,
Yeah.
if you think about it, your starting salary is already extremely high,
Exactly. Yeah.
right? And most promotions will be within 10 to 20%, but 10 to 20% of over 100K is
Good
a
amount.
lot of money.
Yeah.
And you're also not considering the real asset that these companies have, which is their RSUs, their equity. And in reality, I think most people, like the software engineers, like that quit after 2 years, are the ones that they originally studied computer science and they got this job to kind of get a name on their resume. And then they wanted to pursue something else or somewhere else. So working at these large tech companies is a dream for most people. Like they aspire for it. But then once they get there, they realize, oh shoot, it's not actually what I wanted, or maybe I'm not happy here, or the product that I'm working on isn't exactly ideal. So then they leave. That's one scenario. The other one is they do a thing called a boomerang. So it's you, for example, you're getting paid 110,000 as your starting rate, and then you realize that okay, these entry level people are now getting paid more because as time goes, they increase the entry level rate to account for inflation. So
Oh. Okay. Yeah.
right? So for example, you're at 110, and then 2 years later, like entry levels are getting paid like 116, and you get one promotion that gives you 10%, and now you're getting 120. But an entry is getting 116. So my full year, 2 years of experience is only worth 4,000 more than like entry level. So what they do is if the company isn't willing to readjust for inflation for their salary, they just interview and go to another company. And this is even if they liked the team that they were on. So they interview and they go maybe like an Amazon to Microsoft jump is pretty common. So you go from Amazon, then you go to Microsoft, and you would get a pay bump instead. So what would entice a person to leave the company would be more money, right?
Yeah.
Why would you leave an existing company and deal with moving if you were going to get paid the same? Unless you hated your job, then that would be the only reason, more money. So they increase your base salary to 130, for example, in this scenario. So then after 1 or 2 years, you don't really like it. And then you also get promoted a little bit more. Then you just jump back to Amazon, and then boom, you would get a promotion even there when you transition. So a thing that people do is boomerang, which is go to one company and then come back to another, and in exchange they either get a title increase or like compensation increase. And that's a pretty common tactic that forces the hands of the companies to pay more. So that's usually how people play if they don't get increased compensation.
Yeah. And that's interesting you brought up that point of inflation because I don't know how much they account for it, but you know, in finance, if you want to be a commercial banking analyst at JP Morgan, so right now, from what I know as for a fact, if you want to work in, let's say, North Carolina, or you want to work like, you know, somewhere in that area, your starting salary is around 72 to 75,000 for the year, starting off. It has that rate has not really adjusted at all. For much, like, you know, because like, you know, 5 years ago, if you want to work at JP Morgan as a like a investment banking analyst, that might be different, but commercial banking analyst or anything like that, it hasn't really adjusted that much at all. I would say maybe a couple thousand. That's it. Like they're pretty. They like to stay firm on their salaries. I didn't know that they account for inflation.
It's inflation as well as for increased cost of living, because things generally do tend to go up in the city. And having a stagnant salary year over year might just also mean that in that city or in that area, the cost of living is about the same, right? So if your housing hasn't gone up, if your food costs haven't gone up, then it makes sense that your salary does not go up for your entry level or for each level. Yep.
Very, very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, actually, I think that's all I want to touch on, because we actually talked a lot more about other things than I expected to, like cars and Elon Musk. So that was very interesting. But yeah, Kevin, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. It was a blast having you on.
Yeah, sweet. It was a pleasure. Thank you.